Hello and welcome to our first webinar titled From Benefits to Bans, the Role and Influence of Technology Impact Assessment. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a visiting research scientist at Arizona State University, and I'll be your host today in this webinar. We have the good fortune of having Professor Roger Clarke with us from Zamex Consultancy based out of Canberra, Australia, and our co-host Bharath Reddy from the Takshashila Institution in India. First, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of Gadigal country in which I'm presenting today. I pay my respect to the Gadi people, including elders past, present, and emerging. This project heralds from the Australia-Indian Cyber and Critical Technology Partnership Grant Scheme, supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs. It's the AICCTP Round 4 project, and we've focused on joint impact assessment of critical emerging technologies in support of peace and stability. The stakeholders in this grant include the Australian National University, the Takshashila Institution, Blended International Learning, the Social Cyber Institute, Include Labs, Southern Cross University, and Arizona State University. We have a series of webinars and roundtables for you, as well as 2 workshops, which we hope you will join with us throughout the whole. And we are able to form a community of practice around bilateral and multilateral tech impact assessment. In our first series, we explore best practices for technology impact assessment, and in our second series, bilateral diplomatic strategies for joint technology impact assessment. And you can see the various foci of our webinars as we go through, building on the original and foundational webinars in series 1. Today, we have the good fortune of having Roger Clarke and Bharath Reddy as our speakers, and thereafter we will have questions. So we welcome you all as participants. We had over 90 registrations for webinar 1, and we are well on the way to reaching that number for webinar 2, and we hope that you will invite others in your circles to gain and provide knowledge and share. I hope that you can begin by writing in the chat. Please write your name and let us know where you're joining from. And we acknowledge all of your lands as well, virtually. We'd love to hear any contributions that you might have that you may support our learnings on technology impact assessment, on peace and stability, and we will reshare those resources with the community at large. So let us know which organization you're part of, what role you have, and please enter this in the chat. Also, why you are interested in this webinar series. Do you have any questions that you wish to have answered as we go through this process? And might you have resources to share as mentioned? We're all here to support one another's learning and growth in this space. A brief mention on house rules. The webinar is Chatham House Rules. Contributions from participants will not be individually identified in any reporting for this project without express permission. Please note on signing into the Zoom, you granted consent to be recorded, but again, no written report will be generated using identifiable information without permission of the individual making those remarks. As well, if you'd like to unmute at any time and share any questions or any comments, you also have the right to request no recording of your commentary. Very briefly in our agenda, an introduction, which we've almost concluded, a bit on technology impact assessment from our keynote, Roger Clarke, who will be providing an overview on TIA, followed up by Bharath Reddy on governing emerging technologies, given a white paper he has just published with a colleague at the Takshashila Institution, and then an open discussion with Q&A followed on. We can answer lots of questions if you put your questions in the chat and get through as much of that as possible. And whatever we don't get to, we will be able to send that to you in follow-up after the webinar. And then we'll conclude with next steps. We begin with Roger Clarke talking on technology impact assessment. A little bit about Roger. He's principal of Zamex Consultancy in Canberra. His early career was in information systems as a business analyst and project manager. He has worked on strategic and policy aspects of transformative and disruptive information technologies, and this has involved many assessments of impacts, implications, and risks of many technologies. He's a visiting professorial fellow at UNSW Law and Justice and a visiting professor in computing in the ANU College of Systems and Society. He's also been very active on numerous boards, including the Electronic Frontiers Australia, the Australian Privacy Foundation, and the Australian Computer Society, and the Internet Society of Australia. Roger, we welcome you and thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Katina, and good day everybody around the place. I'll just add to that a little bit of ritual that I always use, partly to make sure I start speaking slowly and clearly and don't get overexcited too fast, but also to stress that my predominant approach is that of a consultant. I'm an instrumentalist trying to get things done. But I do bring to it quite a bit of background research, other people's to a large extent, but also an amount of my own, and indeed some of Katina's. And that obviously flavors what I'm going to present to you. I've done a variety of kinds of evaluation and assessment over the years, and that's why, I guess, I've been invited to do this opening today. Now, let me just bring up my slides and see if I've successfully screen shared. So if somebody can give me the thumbs up if that appears, please. Good. Okay. There's nothing new on that first slide that you don't already know. So let's launch into it. What I believe is useful is to not just talk about technology impact assessment, but also to talk about the things that are near it and like it, but not it, because that helps us put boundaries around our focus. Something that TIA certainly is not is a mere compliance assessment. These are important in their own right. There's lots of techniques and ways of doing them. They're not all done by lawyers, of course. They're not totally irrelevant. They're not a focus, not for us here. Some assessment approaches are concerned with individual projects or individual proposals. These will typically be dominated by a single organisation. It's about the achievability of that organisation's objectives in a particular context, subject to constraints around the outside. We'll talk about constraints in a moment. Some others are about social impact. They adopt the approach of saying we have some kind of social asset or social value which we perceive as being at risk, or possibly, unfortunately less often, we perceive as being contributed to by some intervention, some initiative. So that's a different kettle of fish entirely. And then, of course, we have a technology-oriented approach to assessment. If we move to the question of the techniques associated with these things, there's many words around and many techniques documented and used. When it's a project or a proposal, we're familiar with business cases being formed, often justificatory, because the expectation is we're probably going to proceed because the boss wants to do it. But that is a technique or a family of techniques, and clearly security studies of various kinds, threat risk assessment is one such term, particular to a project or a proposal, where social impact focus is typically things like data or privacy impact assessment, sometimes broadened out to broader human rights impact assessments. And technology focus, quite clearly, the term that's been used historically since the 1970s has been technology assessment, TA, and I'll stick with that for the first few slides where I'm drawing on existing experience and literature. But a somewhat more descriptive term that you've adopted is technology impact assessment. I haven't found a significant point of difference between the two notions so far. Now, there's any number of definitions of technology assessment. I put 4 in a paper, which is a very rough working paper, but a background paper, and each of them has its advantages. This one I found to be about the most useful. Comes out of the European network of technology assessment officers under various names. The key points to note are that it is a process. Sure, there's a product and there's a report at the end of it. That is seldom what really matters. What matters is what goes on in the meantime and what outcomes or what deliverables and then what outcomes arise. So it's process oriented. Its purpose is to contribute to the formation of public and political opinion, obviously different flavors of that depending on who the client is, what the context is. So that's quite useful as highlighting several of the key words. And of course, there's various dimensions along which scoping decisions have to be made, and yours are going to be rather different from a lot of other people's in this particular program. Now, in looking at this question of consequences, impacts, implications, risks, it's necessary, I think, for us to go back and remind ourselves. I'll keep reminding you of many things you already know. And stakeholder theory is very useful in this regard. Its original creation was in a business context because shareholders dominated in corporations, and it was US corporations that were in discussion at the time. And the idea was created of a stakeholder in order to provide a counterpoint to shareholders in order to get through to boards and analysts within corporations that there were other interests, and sometimes those other interests actually matter. Now, obviously, as the years have gone by, users of systems have been the ones who most frequently have been noticed by shareholders or by corporate executives. Far too little attention has been paid historically to people who are not participants in whatever the system is or the initiative, have no ability to influence it, but are impacted by it. Now, the word UZ has existed since at least the 1990s. I became aware of it in 1991. I haven't found it in the literature any further back than 1991, I must admit, to refer to that category and distinguish it from users. There was a further piece of theory that was done, referred to as stakeholder salience theory, which originally talked about the different levels of power that different stakeholders have in a given situation, the different degrees of legitimacy they have, judged in some way, and the degree of urgency they have. Another has been added, which is proximity, which is not necessarily geographical or physical proximity, but the immediacy of the impact, if you like, is that test. Historically, sponsoring organizations for initiatives frequently consider only those stakeholders who have sufficient power to affect project success. And that's been a real weakness and has given rise to an awful lot of unfortunate outcomes. There's also a question, particularly with very broad scale studies like the ones you're doing here, there's a tendency away from just individual entities, be they corporations, government agencies, or individual humans, an abstraction from those levels up to broader groups of people, broader groups of organizations, say in an industry sector, categories or segments within populations, obviously amongst consumers and amongst citizens. That there are many natural dimensions upon which segmentation can be done, and the interests of those stakeholder groups may be quite different across different segments. But you can also broaden it out much further through community to society, thinking commonly of an economy as being overlapping with but different from a society. A polity must not be omitted from these considerations. And of course, environment, which of course has a number of different meanings, but environment in the sense of the biosphere or nature or the planet is argued by some to be worthy of inclusion as a stakeholder. Clearly, at an abstract level, clearly you can only operate or evaluate through proxies because the environment can't speak up for itself. Now, I want to quickly look at a view of the security model, the standard security model, in order to identify stakeholders' role inside this pattern. These diagrams are my diagrams, but they simply represent the normal mode of thought that's used in security thinking across many fields. My experience is obviously much more in the IT arena, data services, than in others. So as a generic threat, lightning exists. An individual instance of lightning is a threatening event. It can impinge on a vulnerability such as a loose rock at the top of a church steeple. That results in a security incident as the rock falls down. The rock falls on a car, causes harm to the car, causes a heart attack of the person sitting in the front seat. So we have standard models like this that we use all the time. We have a language to work with. And of course, we recognize safeguards which can prevent, deter, detect, and mitigate the various aspects of the security life cycle. Now, the important bit that I want to come to is down the bottom here. What we don't often talk about when we talk about the security model is harm to what, seen from whose perspective, what sort of asset, what sort of harm concerns people. And that depends enormously on your point of view, on who you are, on what your role is in this particular context. So stakeholders should be much more strongly represented in our thinking, and clearly in this context of this program, that's a crucial element within it. Now, I particularly like to pick out one of the many forms of assessment, only partially relevant here, the risk assessment process, which is roughly the top half of that diagram that you can't quite read. It's not intended that you read it in detail. It merely replays what's in all of the standard international standards, if you will, relating to risk assessment at enterprise level. That is to say, within individual government agencies, individual corporations. The lower layers are about what do I do with it once I've worked out what risks I have, how do I deal with these things? So the risk management design phase and the implementation phases are down below. Now, that's all very well at an enterprise level, but it's very single-minded. It's very internally focused, with everybody else, all the other stakeholders being on the outside looking in. We reflect them only to the extent that we feel they might damage the achievement of our objectives. But we can do better. I've worked for some time with Katina on this particular project to examine the extent to which we can adapt from well-established risk assessment techniques and bring them out into a multi-stakeholder environment. And it turns out to not be all that hard. In fact, it's stupidly simple to put in a diagram, much, much harder to actually implement. All it involves is enabling different parallel studies to be undertaken from alternative perspectives to the primary sponsor of the system that we're talking about. And the bits in red are the changes that need to be made in the standard process. So our proposition in that paper, first published in a conference recently and going to journal form, we trust reasonably soon, and that's that proposition is, this is not hard for organizations to do if they are minded to do it. And of course, stakeholder participation at various stages could be very handy. So there are ways of building in multi-stakeholder approaches in various kinds of assessment technique, including, of course, what we have to do in the very broad scale of technology assessment that you're talking about. I'll also draw attention to some experience I've had in some work within the information systems space. We looked at researcher perspective. That is to say, when a researcher devises research and undertakes the research and reports on research, whose interests are they reflecting? And what we found was that 90% of all information systems research, which is my primary discipline, 90% of it is single perspective. And of that 90%, the single perspective is that of the system sponsor. Now, that means that all of the other stakeholders get squeezed into corners. They don't never get their perspective represented in research, but far too seldom. You'd think we do a lot more dual perspective research than we do. For instance, looking at the impact of change management from both the employer's perspective and the employee's perspectives, but we don't actually do an awful lot of that stuff. There's not a lot of well-developed methods in that area. And multi-perspective research is unusual, quite rare in information systems, really. It's too hard. We're concerned about rigor. We don't have many rigorous techniques available to us, so we don't do much of it in practice in our discipline. That's the field that you're in, and that's the kinds of challenges that you're going to need to confront. when you're doing technological impact assessment. Just to highlight a few of the dimensions of challenge or categories of challenge that arise. We talked already about stakeholder richness and about the levels of abstraction. I'll talk about the other two that are in boldface type in a moment. But looking at a couple of the others, one of the givens is that it's fine for us to think in terms of a particular technology that we're looking at. It's fine for us to have anticipation about where that is going to go, but we cannot predict the future. There are many uncertainties, and some of those we've thought of in advance and allowed for, perhaps. Some of them we've recognized but not spent time on, and some of them we find a few years later we never even thought of. And some of the really interesting innovations over time have been of the last category. So that's a challenge that's got to be confronted and kept in mind at all times. The enormous range in the domains of use is another matter, because the impacts, the implications, and the risks may be quite different in different industry sectors, in different social and economic settings. There's also the tension between to what extent are we endeavoring to encourage the adoption, innovation and adoption of a technology, and to what extent are we concerned about controlling its impacts and therefore stepping back, controlling it. So they're short descriptions. Let me talk at a slightly deeper level, like 5 bullet points, about the level of abstraction of the technology, because this is one that I think is always a big challenge. If we take something like the generation of electricity and the different modes that can be done in, the different kinds of resources that we can burn up in order to produce electricity, what scope do we want for any particular study? Are we talking about all forms of electricity generation? Are we talking about all of those which we call renewables? Are we talking about all of those that we call carbon-based? Are we talking about a very specific one? Now, the reason this matters is that the broader your categorizations, the vaguer statements necessarily have to become, and vice versa. As you climb deeper down into deeper granularity, you can make much more confident and much more precise statements. You've also got to think in terms of segmentation, because it may be that we're only concerned about applications in, for example, critical infrastructure, or in particular geographical regions. Now, there's a great temptation amongst regulatory theorists and lawyers to look for technology neutrality in policy. I've been a hefty critic of the very concept on the basis that you actually have to have very specific policies in order to stop the damage arising to the Fukushima nuclear reactor from those that you need to deal with wind farms. It's no good saying, "Oh, it all applies. We are technologically Catholic in our viewpoint. We don't mind. We deal with all of them." To do that, you've got to be so vague that we're only at the level of principles. So distinguishing between high-level principles and getting down to policy articulation depends on the depth of scope that you're going to with the particular technology. Going to the other end of that slide, the other one that I highlighted just to give some examples was we fly into the teeth of a gale in any technological impact assessment, but especially in one that crosses borders, because there are so many different cultures and so many different perspectives on so many of the elements within the field of study, that we have to have some framework within which we can approach this, understand this, at least identify it, and get to grips with it. Now, I've highlighted there the Hofstadter model simply because it's the most obvious one. It's well established. There's a considerable body of knowledge about it. There are other alternatives. What's important is that there be an approach to different dimensions of culture built into an approach as broad as what you're doing. Also, quickly moving on to the practicalities. During a TIA process, there's a bunch of information deliverables. We're all far less concerned about the chapters in the report at the end. That'll look nice. But what matters is that there's sufficient build-up of understanding of a wide range of things on the way through. I'll flog, because I'm always concerned about this, the foundational bits, sufficient understanding of the nature of the technology, the features of the technology, that we can get to grips with the impacts of those features. But carry on through those slides. There's lots and lots of points. Obviously, every one of these is a seminar in its own right. I'd also like to draw to attention that there are different flavors of TIAs. Trust me, I'm a consultant. Would you like this job done for you? Yes, I can form a team and I can deliver you what you want. I can interact with you in order to ensure that your needs are met. This is done all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want, especially if you're paying me to do it. But that's only one way of doing things. I've called it authoritative in the sense that people who believe they know about this kind of thing do most of it, but have reference to literature, but also to enough people outside to be able to speak with, they believe, authority on the matter. That's probably not what you're trying to do here, but that's your decision. The coordinative or collaborative approach is much more participative. It's open-ended and it's open-sided, or open-boundaried, call it what you will, at least at particular phases, particularly early on, particularly once it drafts, substantive drafts are in place. That's a quite different mode. And I draw attention to the competitive dialectic debate dialogue approach as well, because there are circumstances in which this can be highly valuable, particularly when there is inherent contention within the field, and there are many of those that are going to arise from the lists I've seen of the sorts of technologies that you may be considering. Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, obviously, we need an overall process for TIA. But in addition to that, particular parts of it are going to need some solid research rather than just good old consultancy, framing of things and drawing of diagrams. And when we dive down into particular techniques, all of the standard empirical techniques are useless. And the reason they're useless is that we're researching the future. The future isn't there to be observed. We can ask people as many questions in surveys as we like. They're all imagining different things. So the chances of coming up with deep understanding are not high. So we have to resort to other kinds of less rigorous, less objective, I dislike the word objective, but less rigorous approaches. Now, I don't think much of conventional Delphi studies in most circumstances where it's just a case of trying to reach consensus on a few propositions. I do think, switching to the right-hand side, there are circumstances in which grounded Delphi studies where it's clear, here is a set of propositions, here's a scenario, here's what we are interested in. We want you to now talk about that. What are the most important factors? I think there can be some very good insights come there. I call that quasi-empirical. It's empirical about something. It's just that that world that we're studying and have observations of doesn't actually exist yet. That can be very helpful, not prediction, but it gives us a view into the future. There's other conceptual approaches. Visionary depiction can be of great value. Our sci-fi authors have done us an enormous benefit with some of the ideas they've had, as long as you don't believe implicitly in what they said. Critical theory research is not normally seen in lists like this. I think it's important because it expressly recognizes that the disempowered don't get much of a voice, and that those with a lot of power get a very loud voice. And therefore, there's already some politics deep in research processes. So there can be some valuable perspectives brought using that technique. Personally, a lot of my work in the future studies area has been in vignettes or mini case studies. A very successful one by a PhD student of mine who was actually in the law faculty in the Internet of Things arena. Simulation modeling, well established, but you need enough assumptions to be able to get relationships and to separate out appropriate variables. Scenario analysis to me is the most obvious and most valuable and most applicable approach in the fields I've worked in, but don't lose track of the possibilities of game-based role-playing studies, in particular if you're happy with the competitive mode, the third of the three flavors I talked about on that previous slide. Now, I hope I haven't rattled on for too long. I hope I haven't rattled along in too boring a manner. I hope that I've managed to seed some discussion for later on and seed some ideas. Thanks very much, Katina.
Thank you so much, Roger, for setting the scene so beautifully. If anyone has questions for Roger, please don't even hold them to the end. Type them out in the chat. We already have a great question from Dr. Keith Joyner. And thank you so much for those wonderful introductions from each of you. Uh, Please, if there's anything on your mind that you want to share with regards to the content of this webinar, please put it in the chat now that it's working. Our next speaker on governing emerging technologies is Bharath Reddy, and he's from the Takshashila Institution. He's an associate fellow with the High-Tech Geopolitics program, and his research interests are at the intersections of technology, geopolitics, and India's national interests, focusing on AI governance, open source technologies, and telecommunications. He's also the graduate certificate in public policy, technology and policy before he joined Takshashila. And he also worked in telecommunications, developing software for 4G base stations. He's the co-author of the newly released discussion paper, which I all encourage you to read in detail, titled A Framework for Governing Emerging Technologies with Naik Shambhavi. Welcome to you, Bharath.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
I hope my screen is visible as well. So thanks, Katina, for the introduction, and thanks, Roger, for setting the stage for this thing and covering the overview of what tech impact assessment is and the different kind of flavors that there are. So what I'll be talking about is a paper that my colleague Shambhavi and I have published a few weeks back. So what this looks at is, from a policy analyst perspective, how do you govern emerging technologies, kind of setting, using a framework to go through the different steps in this process, from understanding the technology to coming up with governance measures that can address the concerns of stakeholders and communicating this to the relevant stakeholders as well. So what I'll be doing now is just covering some parts of this framework which are relevant from a tech impact assessment perspective. So when we look at emerging technologies, right? So like Roger was saying, that a lot of it is in the future. You don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty about it. So you can't really define what is an emerging technology, but you have certain attributes that these technologies represent. So they might be novel, they might be very fast moving. You don't have a lot of understanding about its impact, there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity about the uses and risks. So all of these kind of shape how you react to it. They shape how the governance, also the way you govern it, the process needs to be. So because there's some uncertainty, you need to be a little tentative. You need to also consult stakeholders. You need to engage them during this entire process, right? And now the challenge with governing emerging technologies is that there are multiple different aspects of this challenge. So one is that there's a pacing problem, and there's usually a lag between how fast the technology is being adopted and the regulation that governs this technology, how well it can keep up to addressing the risks and harms and from this technology. So you see that the pacing problem has become bigger as we have come to the information age, as the pace of technology adoption also is much faster now. So this pacing problem also exacerbates some of the challenges with governing these technologies. And you see that policymakers must balance multiple objectives, often competing with each other, and different stakeholders during this process are trying to have different concerns about the technology itself, and they're trying to influence the policy making process. And the challenge is in how do you balance these different stakeholder concerns, and how do you govern the technology. And the priorities for governance also evolve across the technology's life cycle. So in an early stage, you're still discovering what the capabilities of that technology are. But as it becomes more mature and it's adopted, you see that the risks are greater because the scale of impact also will be much higher when it's leading towards commercialization and deployment at scale. So in addition to all of these things, over the past few years, we have seen that geopolitics also adds a new dimension to this governance. You see that between the US and China specifically, there's there's a great power competition. There's a lot of focus from a governance perspective on strategic autonomy in technologies, supply chain security. How do you safeguard your critical infrastructure? How can you be more competitive? And what are those bottlenecks? And how do you, leverage your control of those critical bottlenecks? So all of these also add a new dimension to governing these technologies. So in this kind of an environment, what we have tried to do is come up with a framework to progress systematically from understanding the technology to coming up with a governance proposal for this, right? So we'll pick a few of these stages to just explore so that we can get a sense of what this framework would involve. So to start with, when you're trying to understand a technology, there are many dimensions to understanding the technology itself, right? So one of them could be about understanding the costs, input, supply chains that are involved in building this kind of a technology. So you might, if you take the semiconductor industry, which has seen a lot of interest of late, you'll see that it is distributed, the supply chain is distributed across the globe. There are many, from the research to the design to manufacturing, assembly, distribution. So there are many points in that supply chain, and it's a globally distributed supply chain. There are bottlenecks and in different parts of this. There's a lot of entry barriers to get into things like this. So you'll see that how it's being governed also has a lot to do with the risks that countries face because of this, the disruptions that we have seen over the past because of the nature of this supply chain. So that's one aspect. Another is how mature the technology is currently. So typically we see that there's technology, progresses in sort of an S curve. So from the scientific discovery to the invention to say commercialization, adoption, and commoditization, there's the progress of the technology itself follows something of an S curve, and at different points on this curve, you'll see that the governance priorities also are evolving. So at early stages, you're more likely to you would like to encourage innovation, you would like to explore the possibilities. But as it gets deployed more widely, your priorities might be more towards mitigating some of the risks that are there because the scale of impact is also much higher. And then you need to think about global competitiveness. This might involve looking at how what are the inputs that go into the technology, how inputs like factor conditions like raw materials or even talent that is required to build this. And then you need to see how the domestic industry is, how innovative it is, the complementary industries that go into building something like this. So a lot of these kind of define how globally competitive an industry, a technology can be in a particular country. Then you have a lot of strategic autonomy, national security concerns, which have seen a lot of interest in the recent past. So, and the trend that you're seeing that is that something is labeled as national security. So if you see the critical and emerging technology lists that a lot of countries have published, you see a lot of technologies that are there listed on that list, and that kind of when there are a lot of political incentives also to list something. There are a lot of economic and political intensive, and it's difficult to fall back once you have done that. So you have everything being classified as strategic or having national security implications. But what is really strategic? What there are definitions for what that might entail. So it might have something to do with the impact of this technology, the rivalrousness of it, and a few other dimensions, right? So exploring those things and actually assessing if it's really strategic is something that is required. And now coming to the social and environmental impact, so I think Roger spoke a lot about this, where you need to identify the impact on different sections of society. You need to look at the impact on the environment itself. And a lot of these, the assessments will have to provide these insights so that you can make an informed opinion of these things. And lastly, you need to also compare it with existing technology. So if it's replacing something, if it's a lot of technology will just change the way you once it's adopted, it changes the way you think about things. It changes the way what is possible, and some of the established practices might just get which have stood the test of time might just get might not be as relevant because of how we communicate or how we use this new technology. So what is it replacing? How does it compare with existing technologies? All of these are also important considerations. Now, moving to the stakeholder identification and concerns. So this is one of the more important parts of the assessment, which will kind of give you a perspective of how different stakeholders visualize these concerns, how they perceive these concerns. And we've, in a very rudimentary way, we've tried to map it as a control system in the sense that you have society or the different stakeholders being classified into these 4 different categories of individuals, society, markets, and government. And this you'll see that for any technology which is seen as the input over here, you'll see that different stakeholders in each of these categories react to it or perceive it differently, and they will then influence the technology itself in how it is being developed or deployed, and they will also influence how other stakeholders perceive this technology. So you will see that what you end up or what you see as the impact of this technology is a complex interaction between all of these stakeholders and their concerns. So just to get into one of the the process of identifying the concerns of one of these categories of stakeholders, which is discussed in more detail in the paper. So if you look at individuals, uh, what we first need to do is like identify stakeholders at a very at a granular level. And in the case, if you take the AI governance as a case study, you can look at identifying stakeholders from those who are building these systems, from non-AI experts, knowledge workers, and content creators. You'll be able to look at these 4 different categories of stakeholders and look at different stakeholders who might have be impacted at different points in that in either developing it or deploying it or using it, or how it might impact them, right? So you might have different stakeholders, and the first step would be to identify who these stakeholders are. And then you need to go on to identifying what their concerns might be. So our paper kind of looks at a laundry list of different concerns that each stakeholder might have, so that you can narrow down what the main concerns of different groups of stakeholders are. So I'll not get into a lot of details about this here. But once you have done that, you'll get a good picture about how different stakeholders in this ecosystem perceive this technology, what the risks are, what the concerns are, and what you're trying to govern for, right? So that becomes a little clearer. And then you come to addressing some moral dilemmas that you might have. So you might see that a lot of the concerns with a technology kind of stem from um, you know, either when you deploy a technology, how would it exacerbate inequality? Would it lead to some harms for certain groups of people? So those are things which could be mitigated through policy measures, but there might also be certain other kinds of harms, which might be that it contradicts this kind of a technology, it contradicts with your professional beliefs or with, say, your religious beliefs or your any other identity that you might have. It might have it might conflict with those as well. So uh, the process, I mean, and addressing these dilemmas is an important part of governing. So as a policy analyst or a policy maker, you need to be, disassociate yourself, your identity with the broader impact of the technology itself. And when you are able to identify these biases and try to assess what the risk might be. So some of these, the risks that I mentioned earlier about how the technology impacts different groups of people, you might be able to implement policy measures for that. But for the others, which are more in how people interact with it or feel about the technology because of their beliefs. So you'll need a lot of engagement with stakeholders, trying to build a consensus or trying to communicate things better, and this process might involve is important for policy making, although everything that you understand from that process might not necessarily drive how the policy itself shapes up, right? So confronting these dilemmas is a very important step in addressing it. And lastly, I'll skip a few steps here and come to identifying policy alternatives, and we'll conclude with that. So when you look at, again, the same case study of governing AI or some particular applications of AI, you can look at different kinds of what you can do to govern a particular technology, uh, like AI in this case, might be related to what other market failures that exist. So you might see that there's a concentration of market power, or there's information asymmetry, or externalities, and some of them might be public goods because they're non-rival and non-excludable. So all of these um, result in certain categories of governance instruments. So in some cases, you might want to regulate them, some cases finance them because they're not being produced enough, or in some cases, the state needs to produce them itself. So you'll see that the governance instruments that can be used could range from disclosure to, clearing it, like how you see that in the case of the EU, you have unacceptable risks of AI applications and high risk AI applications and limited and minimal risk applications, right? So those kind of tiering, you might have evaluation requirements or different kinds of evaluation requirements, different kinds of input controls, licensing, certification, all of these. So this is one bucket of instruments which is under regulate category. And then for certain cases, you might want to finance it or produce it as well. So what you do depends on what the market failures are, and the objectives might also be not related to these market failures strictly as well. So you might have something related to strategic autonomy considerations, or which is why you're seeing a lot of bans and export controls and all of these kind of things being considered as well. So this kind of gives you an overview of the framework that I was talking about, and I hope you found this informative. And with this, I'll hand it over to my colleague Katina. Um, um,
Thank you
Over
so
to you, Katina.
much. Thank you so much, Bharat. I'm going to share screen simply to invite you to the next webinar. It's case studies, and we're toying with the idea whether it'll be best in class globally or best in class in India and Australia. We'll soon know the answer to that, but you will be receiving communications from us as registrants of this webinar for the next one, and we already have 40 or so registrants for the next one. We hope to see you in about a fortnight. We thank you for your attention and your wonderful engagement today, and we hope you will stay with us for the 8 webinars and the 2 workshops. Have a wonderful day, everyone.